Well, good morning. My name is Jonathan. I'm one of the pastors here at Kings Hill. Today we are going to return to 1 Samuel 17. We've been going through this book together as a church. Last week, Coleman Stuka, our director of collegiate ministry, he delivered a really powerful message on this very chapter. This passage is known by many, yes, by Christians, but also by our secular friends, mainstream culture. This story, it's the classic showdown between David and Goliath. David, here in the story, he is a teenager at the time of this battle. We know this because you had to be over 20 to be enrolled in the army of Israel, and David's not enrolled. He's not part of the army. And so you have Saul, just setting up the context, you have Saul who is the current king over Israel, and yet the prophet Samuel had already declared to King Saul that his days reigning were numbered. Now, this is only known to a select few, really David's family, but Samuel the prophet had already anointed David to be the next king. This was done in secret. And so 1 Samuel 17 is the moment where God is going to exalt David in the eyes of the Israelites. Now, of course, the story of David, right? It's the story of this prevailing champion, but the story of David is really just a forerunner to the ultimate champion found in Jesus. Now, I'm not going to cover some of the remarkable similarities between the battle fought here in 1 Samuel 17 and the battle that Jesus faces on the cross. I would simply encourage you to go listen to last week's message that Coleman gave. Again, very powerful. But what I do want to do is build on Coleman's message. He kind of said, as he ended his message last week, he said, if there's anything I want you to remember, it's this. He says, God's champion wins. God's champion wins. Now, what I want to do is I just want to add two words to that. All right, I want to build. In fact, I couldn't preach this message without Coleman preaching that message, but here it is. God's champion wins, therefore go. God's champion wins, therefore go. The way this drama concludes in 1 Samuel 17 is that David kills Goliath by Goliath's own sword, nonetheless. Now, when the Philistines see this 10-foot giant's head cut off, they're overwhelmed with fear. They run away. The Israelites, in contrast, they're filled with confidence. Why? Because David's triumph has given this renewed strength to march forward to go and overtake the Philistines. And as a result, they ransack the Philistine camp. And so here's what you see. The courageous heart of David has impacted the hearts of those he represents. They've become infected, positively speaking, with renewed strength and confidence. Not only has Israel received the victory that David provided, but also Israel receives David's bravery in which he molded. And so because God's champion wins, they move forward now to go and attack the Philistines. They go, they run, chase off the enemy. I say that because in this room, we've had, 20 collegiate interns that have spent June and July with us. We're really grateful for them. It's hard to believe that they leave, I think, next week. And over the past month or so, we just had a newcomers party 2 weeks ago. And at least 4 or 5 of those that came to the party were interns, and they're just staying in Boston over this summer, and then they're going to go back to the school they came from. And being a young church, we are made up of many young adults, college students that have their whole lives in front of them. And I would say even for those that are advanced seasons, not just a young adult or a college student, there is still ground to take for God as it relates to his mission. So what I want to do today is I want to put ourselves in the shoes of the Israelite army. Our champion, Jesus Christ, has won over sin, over Satan, over death. And now the question is, knowing this, how will we leverage our life for the mission of God? Will we be a fearful generation or a faith-filled generation? Will we retreat or march forward? That's the question that I want to impose and press upon us today. Now, since this is our second look at David and Goliath, let's consider this the instant replay, okay? I want us to capture what's beneath the surface of the text, because we're not just supposed to read 1 Samuel 17 with just the surface lens. There is way more to it. We're going to look at it today. There are layers to the story we have to understand. On Saturday mornings in the fall, okay, I don't want to rush through the summer. It takes a long time to get to the summer in Boston, but I really do love, Saturdays in Boston, the fall, the leaves change, but in particular, there's something I really like, and you can call it sinful. I love college football, okay? All right, went to the University of Georgia. I think we're pre-ranked number 1. There's high expectations. We'll see what happens. But on Saturdays, right, all the girls dress up in their UGA dresses or whatnot. Mom makes a lot of snacks, and we turn on College Game Day, all right? And what I love about College Game Day is usually there is this kind of premier matchup that the commentators spend a lot of time dissecting. Okay, so here's what they'll do. They'll look at the coach, and they'll highlight the coach's journey, some of the difficulties or the victories that he's kind of had through the years. They'll look at the last year's schedule and their losses and their wins. They'll even highlight different players and their stories and bring all of the plot lines together, which add to the specific, unique dynamics of this particular game. So it's a game, yes, football is a game of offense, it's a game of defense. But what this segment is doing, it's adding texture to the game. All of these details are meant to draw in the viewer to experience the game in a deeper way. And so call it texture, call it layers. What we're going to look at today is the story of David and Goliath, the layers behind it, and how it connects to your story. How it connects to my story. And so we're going to first look at the battle. Secondly, that's first. Secondly, God's champion, namely David. And then finally, thirdly, our commission. All right, so the battle, the champion, the commission. Let's now begin by reading verse 1 in 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Sekau, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Sekau and Azekah, and Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle?" Now skipping down to verse 10. And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. All right, so there's two observations, right, as we look at the battle, two observations I want us to note. First, Goliath stands tall against the Israelites, right? The measurement here, he's almost 10 feet tall. But more significantly, he stands tall against God. In fact, he explicitly says, "I defy the ranks of Israel." So I want you to latch on to that word, defiance. He's eventually going to curse David by his own gods. He's going to taunt and mock God's people. In other words, he has no regard for the true living God. He has zero respect for Yahweh. So Goliath here is a man that's full of pride and full of defiance. Secondly, the armor that's described of Goliath is snake-like. The ESV translation, if you grabbed a Bible from your seat, it uses the correct word, but it's kind of easy to skip over. In the ESV translation, you can see it in verse 5. It says that Goliath was armed with a coat of mail. Now, we don't use coat of mail in our English language, right? He's not a postman, okay? What does that mean, a coat of mail? Well, mail means scales. Goliath has a coat of scales. In fact, the NIV translation or the NASB translation would say something like this. And he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore scale armor. Now, why is this detail here? Like, the author really kind of slows down and makes sure that you know exactly how much things weigh when it comes to his weapons, how tall he is, and even describes his armor. Like, why slow down to make sure that we know those details, especially that his armor looks like a snake? Well, may I bring you back to the very beginning of the Bible? God made the very first humans, Adam and Eve. They're placed in a garden. And Adam was tasked to cultivate this garden, to keep this garden, to guard it. Eve was given to Adam as a helper for this assignment. It was paradise, overwhelming the senses with beauty and delight. And of course, the ultimate enjoyment was not just what they could see or experience, but it was that the very presence of God dwelled in their midst. And the only rule in this garden was that they were not to eat of this one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God had good reasons for this rule. If they ate of it, they would surely die. Now that sets the stage, right, for this very first battle that we see in the Bible. Because in Genesis 3, you have this ungodly creature, a representative of Satan himself. And you see this encounter, the serpent with Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, 1 through 5. I'll read it for us. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, did God actually say that you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, well, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, come on, you will not surely die. He didn't say, come on, that was me, I added that. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So what's the serpent doing here? Like, he is coming against the very word of God. You might say that he is defying the instructions that God has given. The serpent has risen up against God, and now the serpent is trying to bring down those God has made in his image. And the serpent here actually succeeds. And as a consequence, Adam and Eve, they're kicked out of the garden. Right? Like, they're exiled out of God's presence. That's the judgment that they experience for their disobedience. Now, to the serpent, God judges the serpent as well. And you can see what he says in verses 15 of chapter 3 in Genesis. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So there's, as a result now, this consequence, God gives this judgment to the serpent. He says there's going to be two offsprings here. One's of the woman, and one's of the snake. Two offspring. And God says between the two of you, there's going to be hostility, there's going to be enmity, there's going to be war. Which means here in Genesis, Satan is the serpent. And he is going to be active in the world. He is going to reign over human hearts. He will win people to himself through deception and then use his followers, use his offspring to accomplish his purposes. So this scene in Genesis is the foundational layer. Right? We're talking about 1 Samuel 17, but there are layers before that. Genesis 3 is foundational. This is more than a snake speaking to Adam and Eve. It's about Satan who has defied God and who has declared war. Now, the next big showdown is in the book of Exodus. Literally, Genesis, Exodus, the next book. And if you know the story, deliverance from Pharaoh becomes this climactic scene and story of salvation. It's the quintessential story of salvation in the Old Testament. And if you remember, the Israelites had become enslaved to the Egyptians, and in particular, Pharaoh. Now, as the author in Genesis kind of elevates the craftiness of the serpent, Exodus tells us that Pharaoh was indeed very crafty. In Genesis, the serpent was more crafty than all the beasts. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 10, Pharaoh devises this plan to keep Israel under his thumb. This is what he says. Verse 10, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, crafty, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and they fight against us and escape from the land. So what does Pharaoh do? He doesn't want Israel to escape. He sets taskmasters over the Israelites, and his heart is also set against God. In page after page in this account, what you see in Pharaoh is this glimpse of a very proudful, very arrogant heart that refuses to submit to God. It's a heart that is defiant towards God. You can actually hear his words in chapter 5 too. This is Pharaoh speaking. Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and I'm not going to let Israel go. So not only do we see Pharaoh intentionally paralleled to the serpent in Genesis with his craftiness, but we also see Pharaoh intentionally paralleled to the serpent in his defiance. And to add to all of this, here's where it gets really good. To add to all of this, the prophet Ezekiel actually depicts Pharaoh as a snake. Consider what God says in Ezekiel chapter 29, verses 3 and 5. God speaking, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon. Now, don't think this crazy dragon that we find in the sky. Think of like this water dragon, right, that comes out of the water. The great dragon that lies in the midst of the streams. And you're this great dragon that says, the Nile is my own, and I made it for myself. You can hear the pride there. But God says, as a response, I will put hooks in your jaws. I'll make the fish of your stream stick to your scales. And I will draw you up out of the midst of your streams with all the fish of your streams that stick to your scales, and I will cast you out into the wilderness. You and all the fish of your streams, you shall fall on the open field and not be brought together or gathered. To the beasts of the earth and to the birds of the heavens, I give you as food. So here you have Pharaoh, the great dragon, the serpent, fully grown, and he's an agent of the ancient snake found in Genesis. And what does God say of Pharaoh? He says, I'll take you out of your habitat. The Nile, which you thought was yours, that you boast in, it's not yours. I'm going to take you out of your habitat. I'm going to throw you into the ground. And guess what? Beasts of the earth are going to eat you, and so will the birds of the sky. All right, now, skip down to verse 45 of 1 Samuel 17. Just giving us layers, texture. Then David said to the Philistines, you come to me with the sword, and with the spear, and with the javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you and remove your head from you. Remove your head, crush the head of the snake. Then I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day up to the birds of the sky and the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know there's a God in Israel. Goliath, you're going to fall as Pharaoh fell. Goliath, you're going to be fed to the beasts of the earth just like Pharaoh. Goliath, you're going to be fed to the birds of the sky just like Pharaoh. That's what's going on here. All these stories kind of come into play with 1 Samuel 17. Now, here's what I want us to see. That Pharaoh and Goliath are agents of the snake. They are figureheads of a war that goes beyond what humans can see. There is a spiritual battle that has been waged, and Satan has risen up against God. He defies God. He hates God. And the attitudes and the words and the actions of both Goliath and Pharaoh show that they are indeed the offspring of Satan as they come up against God and his people. But you see, that the story of David and Goliath, it is connected to your story and my story too, because every generation has to deal with spiritual forces that oppose God. Every generation has to deal with the influences of the snake, the agent of the ancient serpent. So you're in a battle. Our church is in a battle. I'm in a battle. Now, it's a battle that's been won, nonetheless, but you are in a battle. So when you think about, I'll get specific. It's okay if I step on a landmine, right? Gender ideology, or same-sex marriage, or abortion. Like, this is more than just a cultural war. We have to understand, this is more than a cultural war. Like, you have to see those for what they are. They are movements that defy God. Satan has his pawns that he uses, like Pharaoh, like Goliath, to come up against God's word and to come up against God's people. So hear me, this is a new generation facing an old foe. A new generation facing an old foe. People are not the enemy. Satan's the enemy. But you are in a battle. Will Satan win you over? Okay, now I told you there's a battle. We're going to look at the champion and then finally the commission. So let's look at the champion. Let's look at David. If you missed last week, you have the Israel army and the Philistine army, and they're coming up against each other. There's a valley that kind of stands in between of them, right? And the challenge has been made that one person would come from each camp, and their victory, this individual, their victory or their defeat would be imputed to the rest of the army, for better or for worse. So Goliath has been chosen to represent the Philistines. So far in 1 Samuel 17, there's been no representative for Israel until David steps in. He's going to be Israel's champion going up against Goliath. Now, there's two observations around David that I want to point out. One observation as he speaks to King Saul, and the other as he speaks to Goliath. So let's look at what David says when he speaks to King Saul. We're going to pick up in verse 24 of 1 Samuel 17. all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, okay, saw Goliath, they fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. That was verse 32. Verse 33. And Saul said to David, I skipped down. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. And he's been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear that took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and I struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Okay, first observation. I want you to notice that there is a contrast between Saul and David. Saul has not put himself forward to fight Goliath. Like, why is that? Like, for days, right, Goliath has been out there. Who dare come up against me? And day after day, he's like taunting God's people, but no one is offering himself up to fight. Like, why hasn't Saul? He's the king. He's the leader. Well, because Saul's forgotten who the battle actually belongs to. And because of his fear, because of his cowardness, get this, the entire army is scared. So maybe you can put it like this. As goes the heart of the leader, so goes the heart of the men that he leads. As goes the heart of the leader, so goes the heart of the men that he's trying to lead. Here's a biblical illustration of this, okay? Think back with me to the fearful generation back in Numbers, because this is a layer, right, that's beneath the surface that we have to understand and keep in mind as we approach 1 Samuel 17. In Exodus, God promised that he would deliver his people out of Pharaoh's grip. He does that. He keeps his word. And then he also promises his people that he will bring Israel into the promised land, that the land of Canaan. The land was prosperous. It was going to be their home. And so what does Moses do? Well, there's 12 tribes of Israel, and so he picks one representative from every single tribe, okay? And he sends out those 12 spies to go and scout out the land that God promised. Now, 2 come back with a good report, but 10 come back with a bad report. And you can read this in Numbers 13. I'll start in verse 31. Notice the similarities here to 1 Samuel 17. We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land, though which we have gone to spy out, it's a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, so we seemed to them. Then, so those were the leaders, 10 of them come back with a bad report, and guess what happens to everybody else? All the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. So it's like, tell me if that sounds familiar. Like in the book of Numbers, the leaders of Israel, the leaders of the tribes, they go out and spy the land, and they see giants. They see giants. And they're like, well, we can't go into that land. We're going to be annihilated. Like, we're like grasshoppers to those guys. They're terrified as to what they see. And so as a result, the whole rest of the congregation cowers in fear. And that's what you see here. You have King Saul, who sees this giant. He's not looking to God. He's looking to this man. He's greatly afraid, and so are the people he represents. As goes the heart of the leader, so goes the heart of the men that he leads. Now, in each instance, the 10 out of the 12 spies and King Saul, they're refusing to look to God and look to his promises. Instead, they choose to look at the height of men, the appearance of those that are put in front of them, instead of looking to God. And I think this is relevant for us because when God is small and men are big in our lives, then we're going to be fearful of what they think. But when men are small and God is big, then you're going to be full of courage. You know that he's with you. Now, out of those 12 spies, only 2 come back with a different report, right? And their report is filled with one of faith. And maybe you remember who they were. One is Joshua, one is Caleb. Now, in Numbers 14, get this, Caleb is someone who is literally described as someone who has a different spirit. He's wholehearted towards God. This is what God speaks of him. Numbers 14:24. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land that he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. All right, now go back. 1 Samuel 17 was what David says to Saul in verse 32. He says, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of Goliath. So here's the contrast. It's the first observation, the contrast between Saul and David, namely about Saul's heart and David's heart. David's heart's not failing like Saul's. That's the contrast here. Like his heart isn't melted with terror because of this giant. His heart is full of confidence and strength, and the reason why is because he's not looking to Goliath, he's looking to God. And this is why David is described as a man after God's own heart. His heart has not failed him because his heart is like the heart of his maker, the heart of God. Like Caleb, David is a man of a different spirit, of a different heart. So that's the first observation, the contrast between Saul's heart and David's heart. The second observation around David comes from what he says to Goliath. So we just looked at what he said to King Saul, now what he says to Goliath. We've already read it, but let me just underscore verse 45. Again, this is all part of looking to David as the champion. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. So here's the second observation I want you to I want to bring your attention to, namely, is that David comes in this battle, he comes in the name of the Lord. He comes in the name of the Lord. Like, you might remember that Saul tries to give David his own armor, and it doesn't fit, and David casts it out. David rejects that armor. That the courage that David needs to go to war with Goliath is not going to be found in man's resources. He's not going to seek his own well-being, his own safety from the hands of another mere mortal. Sorry, King Saul, not looking to you for help here. In addition, he's not going to choose the most notable weapons of power in that day to conquer his enemy. Doesn't have a sword, doesn't have a javelin, doesn't have a spear, has a slingshot. Have you ever heard that phrase, like, don't bring a knife to a gunfight? Like, okay, Exhibit A. That's what's going on with David. And I'm sure, like, the army of Israel is probably in great distress, right? Like, they see this 10-foot giant, and now they see this little teenage boy with a little slingshot, and they're probably thinking to themselves, oh my goodness, like, whatever happens here, if he loses, what's going to happen to us? Like, how foolish is this teenage? Like, Saul, how could you let this little boy represent us? And yet what's foolish to the world is often wisdom to God. He wasn't going into battle banking on his own capacities or banking on his own strength. He was going into battle trusting in the name of the Lord. I just want us to hear this, that the Lord is not looking for the powerful or the resourceful or the strategic. He's looking for the faithful. So David steps up to the plate. Game on, right? And he faces Goliath, whose name in Hebrew, get this, Goliath's name in Hebrew means exile. Like, get that. Like, what happens when Adam and Eve face the snake and they're defeated? They're exiled out of the garden. Or what happens when the Israelites come under the thumb of Pharaoh, like the snake-like foe in Exodus? They're oppressed. And to speak more about that episode in Exodus, this oppression lasts centuries until God raises up a man who, get this, has dominance over the snake, Moses. Remember that scene? Throws down the staff, turns into a snake, picks it up again. Like, now God's raised up a man who has dominance over the snake. And that was a precursor to the showdown between Moses and Pharaoh, which Moses would succeed. He would prevail over Pharaoh. God would prevail over the Egyptian gods. God's people would be set apart and protected over the Egyptians. So the chosen champion that God raises up in Exodus to defeat Pharaoh, the great dragon, the great serpent, is Moses. And so they're rescued out of oppression, out of exile, to now march forward to the land of Canaan. So you fast forward to David. Just trying to give you the layers and the texture. You fast forward to David, and what happens? Will God's people be defeated by the snake? Will God's people be defeated by Goliath, the snake-like figure where if Goliath wins, now they're going to be under the rule of the Philistines? Like, what's going to happen to God's people? Well, we know the story that God's champion wins. God's champion wins. So that's the champion, right? The battle of the champion. Now look at verse 52, because here you see the commission, okay? Following David's victory. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shearim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. I love this. Here's what happens. The Israelites no longer look to scary Goliath. They look to triumphant David. And because God's champion has won, they go. The courageous heart of David has given new life to the hearts of Israel's army. At first, they saw Goliath. They're in their camps. They're scared. They're fearful. There's all this sort of like anxious talk and fright around this chain. And now, David has won. And nothing's stopping them from going and chasing the Philistines. As is the heart of the leader, so goes the heart of the men. I love this story because Kings Hill, we have an even greater champion than Moses. An even greater champion than Caleb, than Joshua, than David. Our champion, he too faced the ultimate showdown. It was not against an agent or a representative of the ancient snake. It was against the snake himself. It was against Satan. Have you ever watched a boxing match? Who here has watched a boxing match? I was like 1/3 in the room last time, okay? So I know I'm maybe isolating some of you, so I apologize. But nonetheless, all right? You have the ring in the middle, okay? So far, so good, right? It's a little square, little box, unless it's UFC, then it's a cage, but I don't watch that. Okay. Boxing ring, okay? And you have the fighters that are kind of towards the outskirts of the venue, and you have this MC that kind of like introduces them. Let's get ready to rumble. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, good thing I have this job and not that job, okay? But nonetheless, the MC kind of comes up and introduces the two fighters to go into the ring. Well, our champion gets this introduction in his triumphal entry as he rides a donkey into Jerusalem. Here's what's said of him in Matthew 2, verse 9. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Our champion sits on a donkey, knows that where he is going is to Jerusalem, the ultimate showdown on the cross, and he comes in the name of the Lord. Just like David. He doesn't come armed with clubs or swords like the Romans who arrest him. His weapon of choice that our champion comes with to defeat the powers of darkness is a cross. Like the equivalent would be like an electric chair currently. Like it's an execution type instrument. And that's what our champion chooses to use. More radical, more lowly than a slingshot, I can tell you that. And he dies on this cross, and then he comes back to life. He goes toe to toe with Satan, and he conquers Satan. And as a result, there is no longer fear of exile for God's people. In fact, our champion's victory has regained and redeemed for us the presence of God that Adam and Eve forfeited in the garden because of the serpent, that the head of the snake was crushed. Now, with our champion having won, what are we to do? And the answer is, go. Since our champion wins, go. Like the Israelites who followed Moses out of Egypt, like the new generation in the wilderness who followed Joshua and Caleb into Canaan, like this army in 1 Samuel 17 who follows David. Like the early apostles understood this, right? Those are actually the words of Jesus, like, therefore go and make disciples. I mean, they were fearful at first, right? Like when the Romans came to seize Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, they all ran in fear. They scattered, they abandoned him. And yet post-resurrection, they received now this heart of the champion. Once fearful, now emboldened. And they go. In fact, you read about their boldness in the book of Acts. And one story in particular, in Acts chapter 3, you see this example of Peter and John, and they walk up into the temple gates, and they meet this lame man who's asking for money, right? And this is what they say. They say, you know what, silver or gold I don't have, but what I do have, I give to you in the name of Jesus. Rise up and walk. Isn't that remarkable? Like, they're coming in the name of the Lord. The early apostles understood that. The early disciples understood that. And here's the thing. Each generation since, including yours, is faced with a choice. Will your life be described as the faithless generation stuck in the wilderness in Exodus? Will your life be described like King Saul, who fails to keep his eye on the ball, looking to the giant in front of him instead of the God who's with him? Or will you choose to be a man or a woman whom God says of you, he has a different heart. She has a different spirit within her. Armed with God's word and armed with God's spirit, will you go into the world in the name of the Lord? Let me conclude with one final exhortation. Here it is. What you see will determine your steps. What you see will determine your steps. Here's what I mean by that. You can see the world and be seduced. So that's one category. Hope you don't fall into that category. You can be deceived into thinking that life is found in the American dream. Like trust me, like one of the schemes of the serpent is to trick you into thinking that prestige and money and career and all these things will fulfill you. And if you fall for that, you're going to be a soldier down on the battlefield. He will attempt at least to distract you, taking your eye off the eternal things and put them on temporary things. So if you see the world, you're likely to be seduced. You can see the obstacles and be scared. Some of us won't even entertain God using you for ministry, won't even entertain God using you for missions somewhere, or maybe even moving to Boston or some city because you're thinking, I just don't know if I could leave so-and-so. I just don't know if I could afford a place like that. I just don't know if I'm up for the task, if I have what it takes, and all of these are obstacles. And if you focus on the obstacles, you will be prevented from stepping into what God could do through and in your life. And you could choose the life of ease and safety, luxury, but also uselessness when it comes to pushing back darkness. And so you could see the world and be seduced. You could see the obstacles and be scared. Or you could see your champion and be strengthened. You could be a man or woman who steps up to the plate that eagerly desires to make the faithfulness of God known. As the heart of our champion, so goes our heart if we look to him. We see our champion. He has won. And now we go. And I pray that our lives would be like that of Caleb, like that of David, that you will have this wholehearted, infectious faith And so I'm speaking to Kings Hill, but I'm also speaking to the collegiate interns that have been here this summer. I'm speaking to the mission teams that are here for the week. May I just point you to fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith. There is great darkness to be pushed back. And there are lost souls to be redeemed. And there are people groups in the world to be reached. There are cities like Boston to be helped. And there is knowledge of God throughout the earth to be spread. And your champion is one. So I would encourage you, therefore, go. Let's pray.